Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We're glad to have you with us yet again for another exciting discussion. And today we've got a guest, and I'll introduce him in a moment. But before I go any further, because we don't assume that everybody knows who we are, the regulars will introduce themselves. So, as I may have said already, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm the pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Manchester in Manchester, Connecticut, and I've written a bunch of stuff. I belong to different organizations, but enough about me. Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor of early modern European history at Central Connecticut State University and a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Tom.
I'm Tom Price, a systematic theologian, Christian ethicist, teaching both Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and other places.
That's right. That's right. We all have many hats these days. We're in different spots. Anyway, today we want to jump into our show, but before we do, I wanted to let listeners know that that I'm going to be leading a discussion group, a book discussion group here in Connecticut. So the discussion is going to be on pronounce it for me again.
Vindiciae contra tyrannos.
Vindiciate. I've
already started liberty against tyrants.
That's right.
It's only 3:00, Chris.
That's right. Well, I've got my beer. I'm working on it. So, Defense of Liberty Against Tyrants, and it's a reprint, of course, of something that was written in 16th century. Correct, Glenn?
Yeah.
We're talking
1579.
Yeah, and it was in the aftermath of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacres in France. And this particular treatise was written anonymously, but there was a pen name, but we're pretty sure that this is not a real person. Is it Junius Brutus is the name? Anyway, our own Glenn Sunshine has written the introduction to the book, and who knows, maybe we'll get Glenn to show up at one of these book discussions. But we're actually going to engage in a little civil disobedience, and we're going to actually meet in person without masks, but at an undisclosed location, so the authorities won't be able to find us. Yes. But if you would like to be a part of that, that's right. If you'd like to be a part of that, just let me know, and we'll figure out a way to get the information to you. But that's coming up. So today on the podcast, we've got a special guest, as I think I mentioned, S.M. Hutchens, Steve Hutchens. He's one of the editors at Touchstone magazine. By the way, if you hear some thunder in the background, it's because we've got some pretty heavy-duty storms kind of cruising through here in Connecticut right now. And if I get cut off or any one of us gets cut off, we'll just all have to kind of pull in and just keep this thing going. But Steve is a friend. He's been an editor to me. He's looked at some of the stuff I've written. In fact, you did a review of The Household and the War for the Cosmos for Touchstone, if I remember correctly, Steve. Oh. And if you don't...
Sounds right.
You see a lot of stuff. But anyway, we're glad to have Steve with us. Now, when I think about resources that have been really helpful to me in my life, Touchstone is really at the top. I think Touchstone and First Things are my favorite journals, and if I had only one journal I could have, in other words, if there was mail delivery on a deserted island in the middle of the Pacific, and I could pick one magazine, it'd be Touchstone. It would beat out First Things. I want you to know that, Steve.
Wow.
We love First Things, but we love Touchstone even more. And I've been published in Touchstone maybe, 4 or 5 times, I guess. But anyway, it's been a great encouragement to me, and there are some really significant people there who participate on a regular basis in the writing for Touchstone. We just take you to the table of contents here in this latest issue. We've got Hunter Baker, who's down at Union University. There's, of course, Steve. Ken Myers, who is the voice of Mars Hill Audio and the mind behind it. We've got Tony Esselin, who is someone we all love and appreciate, and there are many others. So I won't say anything more about who participates or who's written for Touchstone, beside the fact that if you go to the list of authors who have written for Touchstone, it's like a who's who in terms of conservative and Orthodox Christian writers, and both Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox are all three of those. So anyway, Steve, when I was introduced to Touchstone, I think it was in the early 90s when you guys were just kind of getting off the ground. I received this direct mail piece. You know how that is. You get this direct mail piece that has this thing where you can, write on the back of it and send it in at the expense of the person who sent it to you, and you can subscribe to something. Anyway, I remember that vividly because it had, this essentially this message. This is a journal of mere Christianity, and it had, a photograph of C.S. Lewis, and there was, I think, it was actually a kind of a collage of photographs that were intended to give you a sense of what the magazine was about. And I subscribed to it at that point, allowed my subscription to lapse. I've done that maybe 2 or 3 times. I've self-flagellated after I've done that and resubscribed. But I've been a subscriber now for I don't know how long, continuously. But tell us a little bit about the magazine, maybe some things that I've left out and things we ought to know about.
Well, Touchstone's origins are swathed in the ambiguities of a pretty long history now. It published its first issue as an occasional newsletter of a religious order that called itself the Berean Christian Union. I'll hold up the front page of volume 1, number 1.
Okay. So it was called Touchstone from the start?
From the start.
Yeah.
But the subtitle changed several times. It began as a journal of ecumenical orthodoxy.
Now, for many people, that's like a contradiction. That's like, you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Well, it was difficult for a lot of people to understand, at the very least, and we never found it entirely satisfactory. Robbie George, who's one of our senior editors now, said that our theme ought to be "Enemies of Ecumenism Unite."
Now, in case you don't know who Robbie George is, for our listening audience, Robbie George is a legal scholar, jurisprudence at Princeton, and a very important Christian academic.
He holds Woodrow Wilson's old chair, the McCormick chair of jurisprudence at Princeton, which has always been a bit of a surprise to me because Princeton has no law school.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
But it does have a professor of jurisprudence. So
someone's got to do it.
Yeah, he's a devout Roman Catholic, and is one of those people who was attracted to Touchstone and we to him. So, and we've had he's a senior editor now, and our relation is very cordial. Anyway, the title Ecumenical Orthodoxy tended to set off alarm bells with some, and with others, it was not very understandable. It did seem, as you say, like a contradiction in terms, but it's something that we used from 1986, when the magazine came into existence, until 1988, which was probably the most significant early year. That's when there was a retrospectively now, a bit of a turn, not in its interests or subject matter, but its subtitle. We decided that since the theme of mere Christianity was familiar and to all of us who were editors at the time, and was a friendly term in much of the Christian world, we decided to change our name and use C.S. Lewis a lot more in our advertisements, images of C.S. Lewis in our advertisement, which is not even though some of our Catholic and, as it turned out, Lutheran friends tend to be not all that familiar with C.S. Lewis. But some of the Catholics are intimately familiar with C.S. Lewis and others don't. He's not on their regular reading list.
Some of the Catholics I've known like to claim him.
Yeah, oh yeah, there is that. It's not too difficult to do post-mortem.
Well, I actually know a lot of Protestants who want to claim G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah,
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. By the way, this will be fun for you to know. Canon Press, the people who issued the Christian Heritage series, the book that I just read on Against Tyrants, Glenn did the intro to. They reissued Orthodoxy, Chesterton's Orthodoxy, with a foreword or an introduction by a Calvinist entitled "Calvinistic Chestertonian Calvinism." It's N.D. Wilson,
well,
Nate Wilson.
It's nice to know that there's so much flexibility in Calvinism.
Well, everybody wants Chesterton, even when Chesterton hates you.
I sometimes feel that given a few more years of life, Chesterton might have become Orthodox.
He was kind of moving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So we
think
mean Orthodox in terms of Eastern Orthodox.
Oh, yes. But it doesn't really matter. He's a mere Christian that mere Christians can resonate to.
Right.
But back to 1988, we changed our subtitle, and that stuck. Even though we've had to do quite a bit of explaining and defense of that, because the idea of mere Christianity is a Protestant idea. I think that it's very difficult to deny that, because mere Christianity is to an Orthodox Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox is their church.
Right.
And there is no such thing as mere Christianity outside that church, those churches. However, we have also found that Catholics and Orthodox who respond well to the idea have their own theological ways of explaining the phenomenon, so that we don't have to spend a lot of time defending it to them.
Right.
They may not use, they may be uncomfortable with that terminology, but they tend to like C.S. Lewis, understand him grudgingly, perhaps as a mere Christian, and claim him. Well, the Catholics tend to do that. I've never heard the Orthodox do that, but they might. But anyway, he's not a Catholic or Orthodox saint, just a Protestant saint.
Right.
Although I would name him as my principal theological teacher, if you want to know where my theology. I have read a lot more books than C.S. Lewis, but he provided me with the Catholic small c mind that I was grasping for in my life as someone who was raised in an evangelical / fundamentalist church. And confronted with the Bible and not being able to understand why we interpreted it in certain places as we did. C.S. Lewis seemed to me to have mastered something that my own background had not, and he provided and he sort of opened up the world to me and gave me breathing room. So he's probably the deepest influence on my thoughts. So when someone has difficulty with me, as they have for more than once, anyway, and don't like my theology and want me to explain myself, I say, well, just read C.S. Lewis, and I don't disagree with anything that he says. So
that's right. That's a great strategy. Now, I'd like to give Glenn and Tom a little time to sort of express their own thoughts about Touchstone, or maybe ask their own questions. I've got certainly a number of things I'd like to get to, and I'm sure you have some things, Steve, that you'd like to share.
Let me finish 1988.
Oh, sure, sure.
And this is a bit facetious, but that's when my first article appeared in Touchstone.
That's when everything changed, and everything was up and up.
And also Pat Reardon.
Really. I always thought that he was there from the start.
Well, he was hovering about from the start.
Okay.
And knew the people in Chicago, the Bereat Christian Union people, and he had been invited there to speak, but he had not yet written anything for it. And he was still an Anglican or an Episcopalian at the time. And his earliest articles in Touchstone are about the crisis in the Episcopal Church.
Which is ongoing and worse than ever.
Yeah, well, it's not even a crisis anymore. It just is what it is. One of his earliest articles was a classic called "The Beached Whale," in which he talked about this magnificent creature helplessly thrashing around on the beach, and slowly dying. But it was a powerful metaphor, at least to a lot of us at the time.
Right. Well, of course, he has a fascinating history. He's now Orthodox. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that in a minute. But Glenn and Tom, do you have any thoughts or questions for Steve?
I have one just out of sort of the history of it. Maybe some of our listeners would have this question. You mentioned a lot of people and names. But for those of us, I've been familiar with the journal for a long period of time, but I really didn't start reading it until we connected, Chris, with more depth and getting a subscription. So maybe some of that history, who would some of the figures be that write regularly besides, of course, Steve and George and others that have mentioned? Maybe early on they don't write anymore or have kind of gone through that history.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer with much precision because we are eclectic to the degree that we just publish what we like, which is sent us, and we have never done much solicitation of any kind of writing, except the sort of thing that might go on between friends. Why don't you, Touchstone would like you to write on this, right? We might ask them to do that, but we never paid much or anything. So it has to be a labor of love done by art. And so, but if you look at the list on our website of the people who have written for us, it's a remarkably large group of people. And for the people who are writing most for us, which include Orthodox, Roman Catholics, and evangelicals, and I would say, and we're adding more Lutherans. We're getting more interest from Missouri Synod Lutherans at the time. For a long time, our theory was on people like Lutherans and Southern Baptists and so forth, that they had deep enough resources within their own communities so that they didn't really feel the need of a journal of ecumenical orthodoxy. And for a long time, I think that was true. And it's still to some degree true now, but for some reason we are getting more interest from Orthodox small O Lutherans, which we're very grateful for, because we had some hard words for them, even though we had a regular author, Gene Veith, who is a Lutheran, and who wrote for us occasionally. But we're glad to see that happening. We're getting a little better footing there. Touchstone, for most of its history, in my estimation. Now I'll add the caveat here that what you're hearing is Touchstone through my eyes. I've been with it for a long time, and I've got I've got a range of opinions of various intensities about a number of its features. But for a long time, I think we were primarily a magazine for people who were in transit between one form of the faith and another. Usually from evangelicalism to something else that was more historically grounded and liturgical. I leave it. I leave that in sort of a rough terms, because that includes a lot of people. I mean, from moving from evangelicalism as it was, say, in the 40s through the 80s, moving to an older and deeper and liturgically and sacramentally deeper communion could mean moving to Lutheranism or Reformed expressions of the faith, or Catholicism or Orthodoxy.
Could it also mean, Steve, people who are just remaining put but are trying to enrich their own tradition? You do have people like Marcos, who's teaching in a Baptist institution, who writes for you guys pretty regularly.
Yes.
And it seems to me that he's trying to bring something of the riches of the tradition into that world that he's in. Is that fair to say?
Lou Marcos understands what we're about.
Right.
And he's an excellent writer. I can't think of ever rejecting anything he sent us, or even doing any substantial editing on it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of I haven't got a good idea, a good grip in these days upon upon the profile of the people who are reading Touchstone. I used to be pretty sure about it being a transitional magazine, that people took Touchstone until they settled into Orthodoxy or Rome, fewer into older Protestant magisterial tradition. But many of them going, for example, if you were in the Episcopal Church, you pretty much had to leave and go somewhere. Right. It's very doubtful that very many of those people went to another form of Protestantism. Almost all of those became Catholic or Orthodox. But there are the people who just appreciate Touchstone for, I hope, the quality of its writing and the variety of its authors. Yeah, well, that's certainly true. We haven't pulled them lately.
Right. Well, I think that's true for me. I my impression as a person who's kind of come into the world of Touchstone within the last 8 years or so. I think maybe my first article published in Touchstone was maybe 8 years ago, and having spoken at one of the conferences. There's a sense in which you get this marvelous confluence of all of these Christians who are socially conservative. That's one of the things I think that distinguishes a typical writer for Touchstone. And there's a kind of literary and theological depth to the writing. And I throw literary in there just because there are many journals out there where people have kind of gotten so narrowly focused upon the minutia of their particular theological system that all they can do is debate the fine points of that particular system. Whereas when I read Touchstone, I'll come across stuff that has to do with the Western canon. Almost this latest issue, there were 2 really rich articles on the liberal arts, and how the liberal arts really need the Christian faith in order to work. So I thought those were great. But I think too that there's a kind of strata. When I get out and sort of connecting with people from other theological traditions, and I mentioned Touchstone, if they kind of their eyes light up and they're like, yeah, I read that. I've been reading it for years. I have a sense that they're particular. They represent kind of a part of their own tradition that's in touch with the larger Christian world and has an appreciation for how their tradition fits into the larger Christian world.
I think that's an accurate observation.
Yeah. But for me, it's been a marvelous experience. Like when I spoke at the conference on patriarchy, looking out, there were Lutherans, there were Orthodox, there were Catholics, there actually were a lot of Reformed guys there. I'm talking about, Presbyterians and such. And afterwards, the guys who approached me, who really had some really interesting things to say about my talk, were the Orthodox guys, the Eastern Orthodox guys, which was fun. But anyway, I'm
a lot of interesting parallels between the minds of the Reformed and of Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah. Oh, we need to pick up on that, but I want to. I'd like to return to that. But Glenn, I know you want to.
Probably don't have much to say about that today, but it's something that I have thought from time to time.
Okay.
And which bears exploration.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. One project that I have been contemplating, talking a little bit about with a guy named Ken Boa down in Atlanta, is attempting to do what I would describe as integrated theology, where it seems to me that there are elements of all of the traditions that are really strong, and our problem is that we tend to view them as being the exclusive way of approaching a particular theological idea, and that we've got all the answers within our system. But for example, I don't know anybody who has thought moral theology through better than the Catholics. The Orthodox have got incredibly important insights into a whole lot of things that are frankly gaps in most Protestant theology. Although the Reformers had a lot of that, it's been lost. So what I would like to do as sort of an ultimate goal that I will never actually get to is to try to develop a theological approach that integrates into it the best of all the various traditions. And it seems to me that this is absolutely the perfect project because everybody will hate it. but it seems to me that that's a lot of what Touchstone does. Not so much the integrated side of it, but it's moving in that direction.
One of the things that while you were talking, Glenn, that came to my mind on the similarities between the minds of the Reformed and the minds of Orthodoxy is they both tend to be Presbyterial minds. They tend to operate on consensus more than from a
imperious, dictatorial,
monarchical.
They're aristocratic rather than monarchical.
Right. For example, I know a lot of Baptists who would be very comfortable papists.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean by that. Yeah. I'm sure that many of our Baptist listeners are bristling right now.
But touch not the Lord's anointed.
But that's it. I think that you do have in many, the government ostensibly is congregational, but the way that the church actually functions is papist.
Of course, that of course involves an exaggeration because the Baptist polity provides room so that all three elements that I think are necessary for the correct operation of the church, that is the presidential, the presbyterial, and the congregational function are all working together in a proper way. I used to think there were three kinds of church. I used to articulate this when I was younger, but now I just think there's really one kind of church, and I think it's one of the vestigia trinitatis, that you have within the Holy Trinity a monarchy of the Father, but you also have a presbytery, let us call it, of the Son and the Holy Spirit and the Father together. And that is also a form of a congregation. It's an idea I haven't developed because I haven't the courage.
Yeah, you get into those waters, and everybody's getting back to Glenn's point. There's always someone that's going to be after you.
Oh yeah, well, but anyway.
Another element that's worth considering of the relationship between Reformed and Orthodox, it seems to me, is that from what I've seen of the Orthodox, they wouldn't put it this way, but they seem to be very much in tune with things like the cultural mandate in a way that Catholics tend not to be. I mean, it's not universal, certainly, but in my experience, I grew up Catholic, and my sense was that the church was sort of the church, and it didn't matter whether you were in it or not. If you wanted to be in it, you could participate in it, but it was really the clergy, the priests, and so on. That's what the church was. And so in a lot of ways, it has very little, in terms of popular Catholicism, it has very little to say about your daily life. My sense in the Orthodox is that that's not true. I'm hardly an expert on this, but I sense with the Orthodox that that's not true, that they see the integration of spirituality into the broader life of daily life, of quotidian life, in a way that Catholics don't, that has at least some resonances with the cultural mandate.
Yeah. Well, yes, I think so too. I also think that that there is room in practically all of the classical expressions of Christianity to get it right.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of pressure in those histories that makes it very easy to get it wrong. Mm-hmm. This is why one of the reasons why I appreciate the writing of Solovyev's so much. Vladimir Soloviev, very early on in Touchstone's history, he was sort of an outlying Orthodox writer. We published his short history of the Antichrist, which is available. You can find it online. But it was a story of the last days in which the persecution of the church brought together in a very beneficent and organic way Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox to serve as a final witness against the world of Antichrist, a united Christian witness. There's a lot of 19th century romanticism in that idea, but it's also extremely a beautiful idea. And I think that made an impression on a lot of us editors. I don't know who came up with that, but it was certainly a good thing to see in the early days of Touchstone, an Orthodox writer. Now, there's hardly anyone who would dislike a lot of things about the Touchstone project more than an Orthodox of the old believer variety. But Soloviev wasn't well received in his own day, but he sort of looks like a prophet to people like us.
Right. Yeah, when I look at not only the list of writers, which has a pretty, I think, fair sampling of Reformed people. I know Doug Wilson's written for Touchstone, Peter Leithart's written for Touchstone, and there are a number of other Presbyterians and Reformed who've written for Touchstone. Even me.
R.C. Sproul never did.
Yes. Although I remember that you guys, when he died, you wrote an appreciation for Sproul.
We do believe he was a mere Christian.
That's right. But even more than that, I do think that you guys expressed your appreciation for him.
Oh yeah, and respect too.
Sure.
Full agreement with Touchstone is not a touchstone of orthodoxy.
I don't know if this is significant, but when you said R.C. Sproul didn't, there was suddenly a peal of thunder.
We know
I don't know what that means, but
yeah,
but it's worth noting.
But to many sort of church-going Presbyterians of a conservative, sort of outlook, R.C. is the 13th apostle. So he's just kind of like, he can't do anything wrong. And if it's not in R.C., it's just not important.
Well, that sort of person is not usually very interested in the Touchstone project.
Yeah. Chris, for a second there, I thought you were going to say he was the Pope.
Yeah.
Well, I'll leave that to you, Glenn.
And I'm not going to insult him by saying that he was sincere.
So, Tom, I know you're trying to say something here.
Yeah, it's a couple of things, but I'll stay away from the Sproul question or point. I think we said enough there. One of the things we have going on, I think that's interesting and promising in the academic world of theology is kind of goes under the title of kind of retrieval theology. It kind of uses a lot of the skills that the ressourcement theologians did. But one of the concerns has been that the way in which we understand Christian teaching and the scriptures has been so ripped from that mere Christian center that, of course, it's being read from a whole host of angles that really have no strong continuity to Christianity. So the retrieval is really going back to that shared vision and context that the Christian doctrines and Christian teachings that are central to the faith originally arose. And so there's a strong look at, for example, what went into the interpretive practices that gave us the doctrine of the Trinity, for example, that all, confessing Christians hold to. And then the second question is, you can't just throw those hermeneutical practices away when you hold on to the doctrine of the Trinity, because those two things go hand in hand. And so there's this retrieval of a lot of the ways in which the church approached scripture, the early church fathers, and the way that theologians across time have done it, to where Christians, I think, of all stripes are starting to retrieve the classical understanding of creation, for example, and its metaphysical world. And that becomes something of a resource for actually supplying a very rich understanding of Christianity rather than one that's continuously accommodating itself. So I was just curious if that kind of approach from the world of systematic theology would be something very congruous or in harmony with what Touchstone is up to.
The short answer to that is yes. Let me ask you, when you say ressourcement theologians, are you talking about Roman Catholic ressourcement? The pre-Vatican II sort of...
Lubac and those guys.
Yeah. Well, I think they were attracted to some of the skills they did, not so much to what they found. So a lot of the retrieval theologians were impressed by the way in which those ressourcement theologians actually tried to go back behind some of these deep divisions and find out those points of consensus in what those teachings were before those kind of breaks happened. So retrieval theologians in kind of the Protestant world, for example, would find ressourcement theologians attractive in a way that they were going back to draw the riches out of the tradition and kind of be impressed by some of the skills, even if they wouldn't buy into like de Lubeck's interpretation of it.
Okay. In general, yes, Touchstone would be sympathetic, I think, to thinking about theology in that way. But and I have to tell you that I am simply not up to date on all of the theological trends that you're talking about, especially in modern Protestantism. I've been trying to juggle too many plates for too long, to be a great expert on any one of them. But that's the way my thought career has taken me. But when you start getting into technical questions of theological method and hermeneutics and so forth, you start getting past what Touchstone can do.
Sure.
And what Touchstone can publish, because you're starting to get into technical theological matters. We sort of are trying to sustain an outline within which one would work. And within that outline, one can get into things that are so detailed that you are no longer, that Touchstone can no longer do very much good for you. And we always, and when we run into these things in contributions or submissions to the magazine, we have to say, well, this is a good article, but we can't use it because it's either too technical or it doesn't meet the three-way conversation test. That's a test.
Let's hear about that. What is the three-way conversation test, Steve?
The three-way conversation test is something that we started to talk about years ago when we got good articles from people who were theologically conservative members of a particular church, and which we editors, most of us, have some theological sophistication we could understand, but we're not really very understandable to an intelligent member of the Orthodox or Catholic or Protestant communion. The three-way conversation is not that if you're a Catholic, you can't talk about Catholic things, but you have to write in such a way that a Protestant or Orthodox standing by can see the relevance for the larger church, the church to which they belong. It's not so much a matter of subject as a way of writing. Yeah. And I hope that way of writing is something that Touchstone has historically cultivated. It's like getting together in a room where there are a gathering of people from different backgrounds, and you see your buddy on the other side, and then you go over and start talking to him. But the guy who's standing next to you, who was involved in the conversation before, hasn't the slightest idea what you're talking about, or can only grasp very small parts of it. That's not the kind of writing which we do. And it's usually fairly obvious that when we get a submission like that this does not pass the three-way test, even though it may be a very well-written and very orthodox piece of work.
Yeah, I think that in every issue of Touchstone that I read, that's reflected in just the subjects and the titles. For example, let me just, I've got the latest issue here, and let me just read a few titles to kind of convey what I think you're saying, Steve. So on the cover, or one of the cover articles, Fatherless and Childless, A Dereliction of Duty by our friend Alan C. Carlson. Russia's Confessors.
A Lutheran, by the way.
Oh, really? Russian? Oh, you mean Alan? Sure, yeah. Right. Yeah. One of the things that, of course, surprises everybody about Alan is that he hasn't left the particular communion of Lutheranism that he belongs to.
Actually,
I talked to him about.
Actually, he has now.
Oh, he has. So he finally went too far?
He finally, well, I mean, we were kind of surprised at that. We were wondering how a member of the ELCA could put up with that. It was one of those family churches. His family had lived in the Rockford, Illinois area for many, many years. It's not that easy to abandon the denomination. But finally, Alan is attending and his family are attending a Missouri Synod Church now.
Okay.
Which is kind of a relief to me.
Yeah. Well, the way I always put it when people ask me about that, because I've been with Alan a few times, and people know that I'm connected to him or know him, and they'll ask me, what's the deal with Alan and Lutheranism? I say, basically, he's a genuine conservative in the sense that, he's the same as they used to be. It's everything around him that's changed.
Well, he's just a Swede, and Swedes don't move too fast.
Yeah. By the way, Steve, I can't not throw this in. Historically, I'm a 16th century specialist. Historically, Lutherans have never played well with others. So it's not a surprise to me that they're kind of late to the game with Touchstone, but I'm starting to join.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's great. Now, here are a few others. John Paul II at 100, which is an appreciation of his contribution to the larger church. C.S. Lewis and geocentrism. That in and of itself just sort of like is the story of Touchstone. Dali's crucifixion, Salvador Dali. So, Dali.
Yeah, that was a surprise to me. I never expected to see anything like that. But I couldn't find anything wrong with that article, although I really tried.
But you see, that's what I mean by the literary and the Orthodox and the conservative, and then this three-way conversation. So like my first piece that I mentioned this to you last time we talked, the first piece that was published of mine in Touchstone was something on the Shakers. And as I was thinking about it, I thought, because I wanted to use the name or the term nutty Gnostics. And I thought, who in the world would publish something that called the Shakers nutty Gnostics? And I thought of two publications, First Things and Touchstone. And I said, I'm going to go for Touchstone because I like them a whole lot. And Jim Kushner liked it. And that was my first article on Touchstone. But anyway, but I think that gives our listeners a sense of what Touchstone's about. It's a great magazine. And I think Touchstone really punches above its weight, if you know what I mean. I mean, Scalia, Anthony Scalia, I remember he was a speaker at a Touchstone conference years ago, and I saw a picture of him there with Touchstone. I suspect he was a subscriber. Maybe I'm assuming too much.
Well, we know that his son is a subscriber.
Yeah.
Father Scalia, his Anthony's son,
right,
has been a Touchstone subscriber. I don't know if he still is, but Scalia was at a Touchstone banquet that we held in Washington it was quite a few years back now, and along with a lot of other important Catholics who Robbie George was really introducing to Touchstone.
Yeah.
But his son is a priest, and he is a subscriber to Touchstone, or at least he was last I knew.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but I think that's probably the case. There are lots of folks who are subscribing to Touchstone who are pretty significant in their particular world. And so when I say punch above its weight, that's what I'm getting at. There's a sense of its reach. If you're published in Touchstone, you don't really realize just how sort of broad your audience is.
We don't appear to have the weight of First Things, but we've never tried to compete with them. Mm-hmm. First Things it began under Father Newhouse as a very well-funded journal of religion and public affairs that was overseen by a Catholic, but was not a Christian magazine. It was a conservative magazine. I think in the early years we got a lot of their cast-offs got sent our way. I don't think that's happening much anymore. But it has the appearance of more weight because of the length and density of its articles. But we've always regarded them as another good magazine, and have learned what we can from it. We wish we could learn how it gets all that money, but we've always been sort of struggling, and we have magazine, and we've also tried to put some white spaces in the writing. So that it is not as difficult for, we're aiming for an intelligent ecumenical audience. But in intelligence and the sort of concentration one needs to read First Things profitably are two different things. And in the early years, of course, when Father Newhouse was still writing, we heard just too many stories of people saying, oh yeah, I read First Things and I'm going to get to those articles one of these days, but I always read Father Newhouse and I never seem to get back to the rest of it.
Well, he spoke so kind of from the hip, so to speak. He was funny, but I think
he was our friend too.
Oh yeah, yeah.
For most of his tenure at First Things, although he said some unpleasant things about Lee Pottles that we took issue with him for. But,
I remember hearing about that,
which was too bad because it was right at the end of his career.
Right.
But he was our friend and gave us a lot of help and support.
Well, speaking to the sort of the nature of Touchstone, just sort of fleshing it out a little more, I've always, when I think about Touchstone and First Things, I'm on good terms with both magazines. I love them both. In fact, I'd love to have Mark Bauerlein, one of the editors at First Things, on the show, talk about First Things a little bit sometime. But I think, and I mentioned this to you before, Steve, there's more of a kind of devotional quality to Touchstone, if you know what I mean. I mean, it's not like Our Daily Bread or something. Don't get me wrong, but it's clear that when the writing, when you read something in Touchstone, you have a very serious and devout person reflecting upon something. When I read something in or in First Things, sometimes I'm not entirely sure that's the case. It's almost as though it's strictly academic prose, if you get what I mean.
A little more abstract than Touchstone tends to be.
Right.
Well, and I would add that, when I was trying to explain the difference between the two to my wife, I said that if you're going to find an article on art, on literature, on Lewis or Tolkien or Chesterton or something like that, I bet 9 times out of 10 it'll be in Touchstone rather than First Things, and maybe more than that.
Right.
So
I think
there's a different kind of focus in the magazine as well. You mentioned that First Things was really a public affairs or something to that effect in its origin. I didn't know that, but I can really see it. Their emphasis is really in a different area. It's not bad. It's just different.
Right. That's how we would put it too. Yeah. And most of us are readers of First Things too, and but we all miss Father Newhouse.
Right. Say one of the things that I think has been really neat to see is the revival of your annual conference. I know you couldn't do it this year because of the COVID thing, but last year's conference, was every speaker was a headliner. The year before, when I was part of it, Patriarchy, it was sort of like, can you believe that they actually had a conference entitled Patriarchy in this day? And then you had this list of, really high quality speakers. And then we had Milo there. And I don't know if you remember that, but Rachel Fulton Brown is friends with Milo. And, Milo is a kind of bomb thrower. And he was there at the conference and actually contributed from the floor some interesting questions. But it was one of those things where you say, okay, Robbie George, Tony Esselin, you had Glenn Stanton from First Things, you had Jay Budajewski from, University of Texas, you had Nancy Piercy. You just had this great list of speakers. I think, and it was at Trinity, if I remember right, the Divinity School there. Or is that right? Is it at Trinity or was it at...
It was at Trinity and has been for the last few years.
Right.
One of the members of our board was the president, David Dockery.
Right.
So we had an in at Trinity because of him.
And the book table there is like, it's worth the trip just for the book table. It's sponsored by the guys out of out of Kansas. What's the name of the pub?
Eighth Day publication.
Eighth Day Books, right? I mean,
Yeah.
just a book table to end all book tables. I mean, you just sort of like lose yourself in the book table there.
They do nice work. Yeah.
Yeah. So this year that you had to cancel it, is the theme of the conference that for next year just the same theme, or are you guys talking about something different?
I don't know. We kick some ideas around the editorial table, and that's why it's important for us to get together as a not just to correspond by email, but to actually get together and get what the Quakers used to call a sense of the meeting. You really need to get together in person for that sort of thing and to be expressed in a genuine way. But I don't know what we're going to do, whether we're just going to, because history is changing so fast right now, we might decide to address something else that we hadn't planned. So I don't know. I can't answer that question. The reason Touchstone conferences have revived is that we got a very generous bequest from one of our readers who died and left a big chunk of money to be dedicated to the Touchstone conferences. So we're sort of back to living high when it comes to conferences. Our first real conference at Rose Hill in 1995 was probably was one of those that was funded by a wealthy Orthodox layman, and boy, did we have a lot of money to spend. And so that accounts for the fact that we had Callistus Ware and J.I. Packer and lots of other bigwigs.
Yes, but I guess that's my point. You know, like when I was in Chicago and my son was at Wheaton, I'd go out and have breakfast or lunch with Jim Kushner, and I was maybe once a year, you know, for like 3 or 4 years, we'd get together, and I'd drive into that neighborhood where Patrick Reardon's church is, and right next door is the building that houses or it's just the house that houses.
It's a house,
yeah. The Fellowship of St. James and the work of not only Touchstone but also Salvo and other things as well. But I think that if anyone has concerns about where their money goes, I think you guys are really marvelous and frugal managers of resources. And like I said, if sort of the bang for the buck or punching above the weight, all that kind of stuff, I think that really characterizes what you guys are about.
I think we've done a good job there. Yeah, we certainly handle money carefully.
Right. So tell us a little bit. We're kind of getting to a point where we should probably start wrapping things up. I think. Tell us about the future of Touchstone. Where do you think it's going to go? Is there anything that we should know about, pray about? I just want it to continue and prosper. I hope that it does. But is there anything that's in the works?
Well, I doubt if any project of this sort will continue and prosper for very long. I'm rather skeptical about that. I think that the plant lives and dies, and that we all have and we can hope that we are doing the Lord's work for as long a time as possible. There are a number of things that could smother the wick. One would be persecution, where the government actually is able to close down operations like ours. Another, which I've been concerned about for a long time, is actual dissension being raised within the group of people who are responsible for Touchstone. Because the sort of people we have working on the project are not weak Protestants or weak Catholics or weak Orthodox. They're devout Catholics who know why they're Catholics. and know why they're not Protestants. And the same is true for the Orthodox and the Protestants, which it always looks to me like a tinderbox. And I think only the prayers of the faithful keep us together. It's not that we've had any big upsets along those lines yet, but I think, but for the grace of God, we could have problems. I see in the future the problems being more along the lines of two minds, which may eventually emerge in Touchstone circles, which they're not exactly what I would call the Eastern and Western mind, because you have elements of both of these in the West and in the East. But one is a mind that is controlled pretty much by discursive logic, and the other is a mind that is controlled by paradox. I think though there you have two minds which if they're not in conflict, it needs to be explained why. But
maybe you guys need to lead with Chesterton more and less with Lewis or something. I don't know. It just
Lewis was an example of the second mind that I mentioned. He's a man of paradox, and certainly Chesterton is. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, evangelicalism likes to claim Lewis as one of their saints, but it disagrees with so many things that Lewis agreed with. I mean, Lewis was strongly opposed to women's ordination, for example, on theological grounds. The leadership of the evangelical movement is not, as far as I can tell.
Well, I think they're more and more. I would say that maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the center of gravity was male-only ordination, but I think it's shifted. I think there are still strongholds that are holding out. But I do think that if to give people who are unfamiliar with Touchstone a sense of what maybe sort of our kind of bedrock or touchstone kind of issues.
We do use the adjective Touchstonian.
But I think
we often reject articles because they're not Touchstonian.
Well,
in other words, the author doesn't know what all of this is about.
Yeah. Well, let me suggest a couple of them. One is male-only ordination. I think that if you had an article submitted, strongly advocating female ordination or the ordination of women, you wouldn't accept it. And I think the other is pro-life. I think you guys are completely and unapologetically pro-life. So those are two sort of social and theologically conservative commitments that I see as being part of the touchstones.
Yes, I think you're probably right. And we like to say that we are focused on the creed or the Vincentian canon, and we understand so we don't look at and we believe that patriarchy is part of the creed. That you begin with God the Father Almighty. Believe it, the Trinitarian statement, and all Trinitarian statements are inherently patriarchal. So it's not exactly that. And so within that context, we reject women's ordination. Now, there are more technical reasons, but it's pretty much water under our bridge. We don't even really consider these. We used to talk about them a lot more than we do, but we're pretty fixed in our, patriarchal cave. And it's not something that we even think should be on the agenda.
Right.
And yes, we don't accept anyone who said any articles from people who say, we need to really talk about this. No, we don't. Neither does the PCA.
That's right. I agree. I wish that we weren't talking about it. I wish we just put it all to bed. But anyway.
But anyway, pro-life is yes.
Yeah, right.
To us, certainly that's mere Christianity.
Yeah, the three of us are in complete agreement with that. And I think our listeners needed to hear that, because I think that's an important thing for them to know, because I know our listeners would say, that's great to know that Touchstone has those commitments. Anyway, we should probably wrap up. Is there anything you want to ask in conclusion, Glenn? Anything you've maybe been thinking about, want to say?
Nothing to ask. I just wanted to register my vote for ecumenical orthodoxy. I think it's an endeavor that we should all be working toward.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think we'll be forced to come to that conclusion at the end anyway.
Well, that's more or less what the message of that Antichrist, the sort of the history of the Antichrist, I think I sense that.
Well, what I think is going to happen, and this, of course, is my speculation, and it's not official Touchstonian dogma, is that a lot of the things that we argue about will become clear within about the first 3 seconds of getting to heaven, and they won't be discussed anymore.
There simply won't be issues. I would actually, along with the short history of the Antichrist, I would go to Ben Franklin. If we don't hang together, we will most assuredly hang separately.
No question.
Right. So, Tom, anything you want to say or ask before we wrap it up?
Well, it was wonderful to have this conversation. We definitely hope you'll come back and join us. I think you'll find that a lot of the topics we have definitely commensurate with the Touchstonian dogmas.
Right.
And,
very pleased to meet you and honored to be your guest today.
Well, thank you for participating, Stephen. And I think we'll probably have Jim on someday. Jim Kushner, maybe Alan, if Alan can do it. There are just a number of people that we really like that are part of the Touchstone universe.
Jim's been with it from the very beginning, and he knows a great deal more of the history and background than I do.
Sure. Well, nevertheless, it's been great to have you, Steve. So as we wrap up, just want to say one thing before we conclude, and that is that there's a conference coming up for the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network, and of course our show, the Theology Pugcast, is one of several shows that belong to this network, and it's going to happen in Nashville, Tennessee, and it's October 1st through the 3rd, and we'd really love to see you there. I know Glenn is definitely going to be there. I'm working to be there. Tom can't be there, but may be there. Or I don't know where Tom is on that, but we. But
trying to
anyways,
be there.
But anyway, we're going to be meeting in Nashville, and we'd love to have you as part of that. So check out the conference at the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network and sign up for that.
Laugh, Feast.
Yeah. It's a very much a kind of a Moscovian thing. I don't know if you're aware of what's going on in Moscow, Idaho, with Doug Wilson and Peter Leithart and all those guys who were kind of part of New St. Andrews College up there.
I know a little bit about them, but not very much. Yeah.
Well, anyway, there's a kind of very Chestertonian Calvinism that is characterizes that whole kind of network, and so Fight, Laugh, and Feast. I think sort of express the idea that we should be happy warriors in this whole matter of Christendom and waging fighting the good fight.
Well, I do remember that Mr. Chesterton used to toss buns up and catch them in his mouth for the amusement of children.
Well, I can imagine some folks in Moscow, Idaho doing that too. Anyway, well, thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast, folks, and we hope to have you back for the next show. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye now.